Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Modern Myths, Adventures in the Machinery of the Popular Imagination, by Philip Ball. Narrated by Gabriel Vaughan. Myths often do a lot of theoretical good, while they are still new. Gilbert Ryle, The Concept of Mind. A whole volume could well be written on the myths of modern man, on the mythologies camouflaged in the plays that he enjoys, in the books that he reads. The cinema, that dream factory, takes over and employs countless mythical motifs. Mircea Eliade, The Sacred and the Profane. Chapter 1. How can a myth be modern? We can start almost anywhere, and there's no virtue in being highbrow about it. So why not with the 2004 movie Van Helsing, starring Hugh Jackman as the famous vampire hunter? Aside from his name and calling, this youthful, dark-locked, brawny action hero has nothing in common with Dracula's venerable nemesis in Bram Stoker's novel. It's not only the blood-sucking count he's pursuing, but a legion of monsters that includes Frankenstein's creature and the brutish Mr. Hyde. We know we are in safe hands here, for Jackman and his screen lover, Kate Beckinsale, are genre stalwarts, much as Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Boris Karloff, and Bela Lugosi were in their day. The texture of the movie is familiar too, comic strip gothic, lit by moonlight and bristling with razor-fanged CGI beasts, the framing and aesthetic echoing the graphic novels of Frank Miller and Alan Moore. The imagery is iconic. Here is Dracula's castle, much as it was in the 1931 Lugosi movie directed by Todd Browning. There is Frankenstein's electrified laboratory, full of sparks and shadows, where Karloff's creature rose up in the same year. And here comes the flat-headed monster himself, his patchwork skull apt to fly open in slapstick fashion to reveal a sparking brain. We forgive Van Helsing for becoming a werewolf and killing his paramour. Heroes these days are prone to such things. Van Helsing is a stupendously silly homage, about as scary and unsettling as a soap opera, and I rather enjoyed it. There doesn't, though, appear to be much we can learn about our modern myths from this sort of good-natured romp, with its relentless computer game dynamic, cheap sentimentalism, and makeshift Frankensteinian mosaic of motifs. Surely it does for these myths only what Ray Harryhausen did for the classical myths of Greece, turning them into a parade of cinematic effects with not a care for coherence or poetry. I don't mean that in a bad way. Still, you know what I'm talking about, don't you? You know what Van Helsing, in its clumsy, carefree fashion, is up to. You know that the seam it is exploiting, the language it is using, is indeed that of myth. I hope I am not being condescending when I suspect that few among Van Helsing's target audience, hormonal adolescents eager for violent action, sexy vampires, and spectacle, will have read Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. These are stories that everyone knows without having to go to that trouble. They have seeped into our consciousness, replete with emblematic visuals before we reach adulthood. I met Robinson Crusoe in a black-and-white French television series from the 1960s, in which nothing much seemed to happen, save for the discovery of that momentous footprint in the sand. Like many of my generation, I can hum the theme tune today. Frankenstein arrived as a glow-in-the-dark model kit of the Karloff incarnation, arms outstretched to claim his next victim. It was not actually Frankenstein, of course, but his monster, although the box didn't tell me that. The stingray alien craft of George Paul's 1953 movie The War of the Worlds were ominous enough to distract us from the wires from which they dangled. Dracula, well, he was Christopher Lee. Everyone knew that. This cultural osmosis is how we learn our modern myths. For myths are what these stories are, and to suggest, as some purists do, that the Hammer films or Hollywood adaptations traduce the real story is to miss their point. In this book, I propose that the Western world has, over the past 3 centuries or so, produced narratives that have as authentic a claim to mythic status as the psychological dramas of Oedipus, Medea, Narcissus, and Midas, and the ancient universal myths of creation, flood, redemption, and heroism. Myths have no authors, although they must have an origin. They escape those origins and their originators not simply because they are constantly retold with an accumulation of mutations, appendages, and misconceptions. Rather, their creators have given body to stories for which retellings are deemed necessary. What is it in these special tales that compels us so compulsively to return to them? Each age finds different answers, and this, too, is in the nature of myth. Why are we still making myths? Why do we need new myths? And what sort of stories attain this status? In posing these questions and seeking answers, I shall need to make some bold proposals about the nature of storytelling, the condition of modernity, and the categories of literature. I don't claim that any of these suggestions is new in itself, but the notion of a modern myth can give them some focus and unity. We have been skating around that concept for many years now, and I can't help wondering if some of the reticence to acknowledge and accept it stems from puzzlement, and perhaps, too, a sense of unease, that Van Helsing is a part of the story. Not just that movie, but also the likes of I Was a Teenage Werewolf and Zombie Apocalypse, as well as children's literature and detective pulp fiction, not to mention queer theory, alien abduction fantasies, video games, body horror, and artificial intelligence. In short, there are a great many academic silos, cultural prejudices, and intellectual exclusion zones trammeling an exploration of our mythopoeic impulse. Even in 2019, for example, a celebrated literary novelist, dipping his toe into a robot narrative, could suppose that real science fiction deals in traveling at 10 times the speed of light in anti-gravity boots, as opposed to looking at the human dilemmas of being close up. It is precisely because our modern myths go everywhere that they earn that label, and for this same reason we fail to see, or resist seeing them for what they are. As classical myths did for the cultures that conceived them, modern myths help us to frame and come to terms with the conditions of our existence. Evidently, this is not all about literary books. Myths are promiscuous. They were postmodern before the concept existed, infiltrating and being shaped by popular culture. To discern their content, we need to look at comic books and B-movies as well as romantic poetry and German expressionist cinema. We need to peruse the scientific literature, books of psychoanalysis, and made-for-television melodramas. Myths are not choosy about where they inhabit, and I am not going to be choosy about where to find them. The idea of a modern myth, admits literary critic Chris Baldick, simply should not exist, according to the most influential accounts of what a myth is. The consensus in discussion of myths is that they are defined by their exclusive anteriority to literate and especially to modern culture. Myth is a lost world, to which modern writers may distantly and ironically allude, but in which they can no longer directly participate. Like Baldick, I think this traditional view is entirely the wrong way to understand what a myth is. I will try to explain why. The word myth is bandied about with dreadful abandon, as if it doesn't much matter what it means. Often now it is used to stigmatize a widely held misconception, the myth that the moon landings were staged in a Hollywood studio, or that Nelson Mandela died in the 1980s, or that eating carrots improves your eyesight. It can mark a clumsy attempt to disguise a franchise as an epic. Star Wars is mythic, right? We'll see about that. Or perhaps a story becomes a myth just by being much retold. Experts, I fear, aren't much help here. You can collect academic definitions for as long as your patience lasts. The word myth, as Northrop Frye rightly says, is used in such a bewildering variety of contexts that anyone talking about it has to say first of all what his chosen context is. Folklorist Liz Locke put it more bluntly in 1998. Such a state of semantic disarray and/or ambiguity is truly extraordinary. Finnish folklorist Lauri Honko nonetheless gives a definition that kind of sounds like what you'd expect from an expert. A myth is a story of the gods, a religious account of the beginning of the world, the creation, fundamental events, the exemplary deeds of the gods, as a result of which the world, nature, and culture were created together with all parts thereof, and given their order, which still obtains. A myth expresses and confirms society's religious values and norms. It provides a pattern of behavior to be imitated, testifies to the efficacy of ritual with its practical ends, and establishes the sanctity of cult. This is a fair appraisal of how myth has often been regarded by anthropologists. But it is fraught with dangers and traps. Like the word anthropology itself, it seems to offer an invitation to make myth something other, something belonging to cultures not our own, and most probably to ones that, even in the circles of liberal academics, retain an air of the primitive. Gods, creation, ritual, cult. These are surely notions that we in the developed world have left behind and only pick up again with an air of irony. Our gods are not real beings or agencies, but metaphorical cravings. He worships money, or celebrities, rock gods and sex goddesses. Our rituals, not invested with any spiritual content, except in churches, mosques, and temples attended by the devout, are empty, or, at best, time-honored habits we indulge for the social sanction they offer, marriages and funerals, say. Our cults are brainwashing sects isolated from regular society. And so, likewise, our myths are things that many people believe to be true, but that aren't really. Or as urban myths, oft-told tales that likely never happened. Our popular narrative, then, is that we shed mythology in its traditional sense, probably during the process that began in the Enlightenment, in the course of which the world became disenchanted by the advance of science, and that has led since to a secular society on which the old deities have lost their grip. We grew out of gods and myths because we acquired reason and science. This picture is tenacious, and I suspect it accounts for much of the resistance to the notion, and there is a lot of resistance, believe me, that anything created in modern times might deserve to be called a myth. To accept that we have never relinquished myths and myth-making might seem to be an admission that we are not quite modern and rational. But all I am asking, with the concept of myth I use in this book, is that we accept that we have not resolved all the dilemmas of human existence, all the questions about our origins or our nature, and that, indeed, modernity has created a few more of them. One objection to the idea of a modern myth is that, to qualify as myth, a story must contain elements and characters that someone somewhere believes literally existed or happened. Surely myths can emerge from works of fiction. The anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski asserted as much, saying of myth that it is not of the nature of fiction, such as we read today in a novel, but it is a living reality, believed to have once happened in primeval times, and continuing ever since to influence the world and human destinies. But this is simply the grand narrative with which Malinowski and his generation framed their study of the myths of primitive cultures. It allows us to insist, as they wish to, that we advanced societies have no myth left except religion, and even that is no longer believed in quite the same way as it was a couple of centuries ago. As Baldock puts it, in this view, myth is the quickest way out of the 20th, and now the 21st, century. Even in its own terms, however, Malinowski's definition is tendentious. Did the author, or authors we know as Homer, believe he was merely writing history, right down to, say, Athena's interventions in the Trojan War? To assert this would be to neglect the long and continuing scholarly debate about what Homer was really up to. Was he, for instance, a skeptic or a religious reformer? Worse, it would neglect the even longer and profound debate about what storytelling is up to. It might be unwise to attach any contemporary label to Homer, but one that fits him more comfortably than most is to say he was a poet, and that he used poetic imagination to articulate his myths. Stories like his relate something deemed culturally important, and, in an important sense, true, but not as a documentary account of events. Plato admitted as much in the 5th century BCE. Are we then to suppose that Greek myth was already dead to him? To ask if ancient people believed their mythical stories is to ask a valid but extremely complex question. It is much the same as asking if Christian theologians, past and present, believe the Bible. Yes, they generally do, but that belief is complicated, multifaceted, and contentious, and to imagine it amounts to a literal conviction that all the events and peoples described in the Holy Book occurred as written is to misunderstand the function of religion itself. What's more, while we can adduce a range of interpretations about these beliefs today, it is not clear we can ever truly decide how these correspond, or whether they even need to correspond, to the convictions of the people who created the original text. Many early anthropologists and scholars of myth, and some still today, thought that myths must be sacred. They must have the aspect of religious belief, and perhaps have been used in ritual. This was the position taken by Edward Burnett Tyler, one of the 19th century founders of cultural anthropology, and also by James Frazer in his seminal early work on comparative myth, The Golden Bough, 1890. For Tyler, Frazer, and Malinowski, myth was a pre-scientific way of understanding the world, and thereby of trying to control it. The French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that, in fact, myth was a kind of primitive science, logical and concrete in its own terms. Philosopher Karl Popper believed that science arose out of efforts to assess the validity of myth through empirical, rational investigation of its effectiveness. The evaluations of all these commentators stemmed largely from a focus on creation myths, which are the easiest to map onto questions about how the physical world is constituted and governed. This view of myth is primarily religious, and at any rate pre-scientific is certainly a convenient way of keeping myth at arm's length from today's secular, technologically sophisticated society. But to insist that a religious role is a necessary defining feature of myth would be an arbitrary stricture that tells us little about the social work myths did. It is a view that mistakes function for process, as if to say that the function of a church service is to enable hymns to be sung. It doesn't even fit with the way, as far as we can say anything at all about this, myth functioned in ancient times. As classicist William Hansen has said, there is no real evidence that I can see that the Greeks regarded myths as sacred stories, unless you take sacred in a very watered-down sense. It's undeniable that religion and myth are tightly entwined, however, not least because both address cosmic questions about meaning, which lie outside the domain of scientific cosmology. For religious scholar Mary Mills, myth offers a cosmic framework, which indicates where cosmic power resides, what it is called, and so how it can be used. To which one might reply, sure, sometimes. The world emerging from the body of the giant Emir, maybe. Theseus's struggles with the Minotaur or Medea, not so much. The temptation is to suppose that modern myths are today's replacement for religion. That would be to fall for another category error, however, for religion might be regarded as a particular social and institutional embodiment of myth, and not vice versa. Religion explores some of the same questions about life and death, meaning, suffering and fate, origins, and so it is not surprising that we will find our modern, secular myths still returning to religious themes, questions, and experiences. Institutional religion tends, however, to crystallize from this exploration codes of conduct, values, and norms. At its worst, it seeks to escape from the ambiguities of myth by imposing a false resolution to irresolvable questions. At its best, it leaves those doors open. This brings us to the tidy function ascribed to myth by Honko's definition: to express and confirm society's religious values and norms, and provide a pattern of behavior to be imitated. This is the sober, objective rationalist's view of myth as normative narrative. But whose behavior exactly is to be imitated among the Titans and Olympians? Cronus the father castrator? Zeus the sex pest and rapist? Dionysus the libertine? Heracles with his bone-headed pragmatism? Self-absorbed Narcissus? No, myth is not tidy. Myth is the opposite of tidy. Was Gong Gong, who caused the great flood of China's formation myth, a wicked demon king who broke one of the pillars of heaven and made a hole through which the waters poured, as some versions suggest? Or was he an opportunist human king who simply tried to exploit the catastrophe? Or was he an inept engineer employed by the Emperor Yao to drain the waters? Or was he, in fact, the father of the engineer hero Yu, who finally resolved the mess? Take your pick. This, I think, is the best answer we can give to such questions based on the conflicting versions of myths that have survived, while no doubt many others have been lost. It depends on the story you want to tell. Gong Gong could represent many influences and agencies, contingent on what the myth teller wanted the people to believe about flood control and state authority. A myth is typically not a story, but an evolving web of many stories, interweaving, interacting, contradicting each other. Boil it down, and the story falls away. There are no characters, which is to say, individuals with histories and psychologies, no location, no denouement, and no unique meaning. You're left with a rugged, elemental, irreducible kernel charged with the magical power of generating versions of the story. A function of China's flood myth, for example, is thus not simply to give citizens a quasi-religious account of how their nation began, but also, and more importantly, to help them deal with the ever-present fear of massive flooding. It sanctifies the authority of someone who can cope with such a natural disaster, and even proposes a theoretical basis for flood control. Carve out channels to let the waters flow, don't dam them up. But more than that, it creates a vehicle for thinking about the problem, without offering either a definitive version of events or an unambiguous solution. When a myth becomes a dogmatic social and ethical code, it has become prescriptive religion, or something like it. We have arrived at Taoism or Confucianism, say. When a myth permits of a resolution, when it indeed succeeds in what Levi-Strauss describes as its aim of providing a logical model capable of overcoming a contradiction, though how could it if the contradiction is real, it has become a moral fable. But while it retains ambiguity and contradiction, it stays a myth. It acts not as a cultural code, but as what cultural historians Amanda Rees and Ewan Rees Morris call, apropos the kind of modern myths discussed in this book, a cultural resource. It's unfair to judge the early anthropologists too harshly for the limited and inadequate picture of myth they presented, which was of course a product of its time. They deserve credit for taking seriously the function it serves. As Malinowski said, myth is not an idle rhapsody, not an aimless outpouring of vain imaginings, but a hard-working, extremely important cultural force. Yet it wasn't until around the middle of the 20th century that such scholars began to recognize the obvious corollary, that the work demanded of this cultural force does not simply vanish with modernity, and that there is nothing essentially ancient about myth. Philosopher Ernst Cassirer was perfectly happy with the idea that myths are still being produced, especially in the political sphere. He regarded Nazism as an instance. In all critical moments of man's social life, he wrote, the rational forces that resist the rise of the old mythical conceptions are no longer sure of themselves. In these moments, the time for myth has come again. Still, for Cassirer, myth-making remained an atavistic throwback, a strategy necessary only in desperate situations. It took a theologian to dismantle that idea, the German Rudolf Bultmann, who sought to demythologize the Christian New Testament. To seek historical verification of the Scriptures or reconciliation of their account of cosmogenesis with science is not, he argued, a meaningful pursuit. Rather, their message is ethical and philosophical. It's the same with all myth, he said. It expresses timeless human experience. The real purpose of myth is not to present an objective picture of the world as it is, but to express man's understanding of himself in the world in which he lives. Myth should be interpreted not cosmologically, but anthropologically, or better still, existentially. If this is indeed at least a part of what myth is about, then myth-making can cease only when the world in which we live has ceased to change, and when we have solved all our problems and resolved all our anxieties. That, I suspect we can agree, will not be any time soon. The idea that myths confirm social norms and values, that they tell us how to behave, is nevertheless especially persistent. What is the myth of Oedipus if not a warning against incest? Yet, on closer inspection, that reasonable-sounding supposition dissolves. Taboos against incest are pretty much universal, and for good biological reasons. Inbreeding promotes genetic dysfunctions, a fact obvious enough from experience long before Darwinism suggested a means of rationalizing it. And for that reason, too, no society really needs a cautionary tale. To suggest that the myth of Oedipus has this utilitarian function is ludicrous. We all know from the outset what a harmful and terrible thing the hapless Oedipus is doing, and it's obvious he'd never contemplate it if he knew the truth himself. No, the Oedipus myth exists because, even knowing already that incest is bad, still we worry that it might happen. We call the protosexual attraction of a child to his or her parent Oedipal today, not because it looks a bit like what happened in the Oedipus story, but because the Oedipus story encodes the fact that this is what happens to us. That's why the story exists. To create a narrative space for thinking about the unsettling fact that a young man awakening to adulthood may start to look at his mother in a different way, and the mother, in turn, might do the same. To be the object of your child's first sexual impulses is unsettling for a parent, but also very common. Such disquieting but widespread, if not universal, experiences create a demand for myth. We should be wary, though, of concluding that a myth lays hold to a specific dilemma and toys with it. Myths are certainly about things, but they are rarely about a single thing. The Oedipus myth explores what we now call Oedipal anxieties, but bound up with them are questions about how individuals and societies respond to taboo breaking and where responsibility for it lies. These issues change with the times. Did the ancient Greeks also consider the story to be primarily about father-son rivalry and fears around incest? Or were they perhaps more impressed with the way it explored the arbitrariness of fate? An openness to multiple readings is a hallmark of modern myth, and surely of classical myth, too. Another line of resistance to the concept of modern myth takes the form of evasion. So, do you mean stories from modern times with a whiff of the supernatural? Say, The Angel of Mons, glimpsed by troops in World War I. But we have a perfectly good word for such stories already in anthropology: folklore.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?